Good afternoon and welcome to Election Bites, a bite-sized conversation for your lunch hour. Today we are going to be talking about the two Senate runoff elections here in the state of Georgia. We have lots of questions. My name is Avery Davis Roberts, and I'm joined today by Kevin Johnson, who is the founder and executive director of the Election Reformers Network and a member of the Carter Center's U.S. Election Study Team. Kevin is now a familiar face on Election Bites. And I think we should just jump right in because I have questions for you, Kevin.
All right, I'm ready.
So, as we all are painfully aware, elections are not over in Georgia. More than 3 million people have voted already in these runoff elections. The final day of voting is tomorrow. But runoffs are sort of unusual, right? Why does Georgia have a runoff system? And are we the only state that does this?
Good questions, Avery. So basically, whenever you have an election where there are 3 or more candidates for one seat, it's possible, of course, that none of the candidates will get a majority, that none will get, 50% of the vote plus one. And so designers of election systems have to consider either of two options. Either they go the simpler route and just allow for one round and accept that sometimes there will be people elected who have not gained majority support, or whether to have some kind of runoff with the top 2 candidates to arrive at a majority winner. So Georgia is one of 12 states that use a runoff in one form or another.
One of 12. But do the other states use them for Senate elections, or are they other?
So let's see. 10 states use runoffs for primary elections. 4 states use runoffs for all kinds of elections, and Georgia and Louisiana are in both categories. So that's how you get to 12.
Interesting. So you sort of indicated there are some pros, some arguments for runoffs. Could you maybe elaborate on the arguments for runoffs, but also maybe some of the arguments against having runoff elections?
Yeah, sure. So there are 3 arguments maybe to mention in favor of some kind of runoff. And the first is that runoffs help ensure that the will of the majority prevails. Without a runoff, it is very possible for the first place candidate in a crowded field, say, to not actually be the person that most people support. So a second reason, which is related, is that elections without a runoff system can end up effectively empowering the more extreme wings of the political spectrum, or the spectrum of opinion in that jurisdiction. And this is particularly true of primary elections. Primary elections have more candidates than general elections, and also primary elections already, the turnout is typically low, sometimes 15%, and it's often the sort of most impassioned spectrum or portion of the voters that turn out. So if you have a candidate who can win a primary election, which is only 15% of the electorate, with only 25% of that vote, that candidate could well be much more extreme than the mainstream of that district. And for a congressional election, that candidate could go on to Congress because many congressional districts aren't that competitive. So that's a second reason that you can get that sort of empowering of the extreme. And some people say that the anger of our politics in part arises not because we're really a divided nation, but because we have these rules that end up empowering the more extreme percentage of the population. So that's reason 2. And reason 3 is that, democracy is really about participation and about giving voters choices. And a system without a runoff can really restrict those kind of elements, because you can have situations where there is pressure, within a community or a party to make some people step out and not participate, so you avoid diluting the vote. So these elements can restrict those kind of core democratic themes of participation and choice. So those are the advantages. I'll go to disadvantages now. So there are 2 that people talk about primarily. One is cost. When you do a runoff election in the way Georgia's doing it, you basically repeat all of the steps that you did in the general election. And that costs a fair amount of money. Budgets are actually very tight, unfortunately, in this country for elections. I think the Georgia runoff is expected to cost more than $1 million for the administration. And then there's the cost of the campaign, which, as we know, is going to be phenomenal in Georgia. And there's the cost to voters at the time to go and vote again. So that's one disadvantage that people cite. And the second, a little bit more complicated, is that turnout for runoff is often quite low. A recent study showed that it was about 37% lower on average at the runoff round as compared to the general. That's not going to happen in Georgia, it looks like. Georgia is going to have a lot of turnout because it's such an important race. But when there is such a low turnout, it kind of undermines the whole notion that this is creating the true representative of the majority because not as many people are showing up. So those are the pros and cons in general.
Thanks, Kevin. So some states, I think Maine and maybe Alaska, have introduced ranked choice voting. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and maybe how it relates to this whole runoff idea and the pros and cons around ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up ranked choice voting because it really ties in very closely. And in fact, in that the figure I cited of 12 states that use runoffs, I included Alaska and Maine because ranked choice voting really should be considered a type of runoff system. And one of the different names for ranked choice voting is instant runoff voting. So it gives you that sense. So the way ranked choice voting works effectively is that voters are given a ballot with spaces on the ballot to indicate their preference, their choices for all the candidates in order of preference. And when the ballots are tabulated, if there's a candidate who has won more than 50% of the first choices, then it's basically like a normal election. That candidate wins, the election is over. If not, then the kind of runoff mechanism begins. And the way it works in ranked choice voting is that the candidate who has received the least amount of votes is eliminated. And the ballots for that candidate are then reallocated based on the second choices. And that continues by rounds until one candidate passes the 50%. So that's kind of how it works. And ask a follow-up question if that's not clear.
No, that's very clear.
I may rattle it too quickly, but in terms of the pros and cons, basically all of the pros that I was talking about there about more participation, more choice, the expression of the will of the majority, not empowering extremes, all of those pros apply to ranked choice voting, and really none of the cons because it's not holding a whole new election with all the additional cost and with the possibility for lower turnout, et cetera. So that's a summary of pros and cons there.
Thank you. And so this is a little bit of a follow-up question. I don't know if how familiar you are with the case in Maine or other places where they've used it. Is it a system that is easy for voters to understand? Has there been public support for this different voting method?
The data is really good on popularity of ranked choice voting and on understandability. The polls that have been done in Maine and elsewhere where ranked choice voting elections have been conducted show really high 90s% of the voters say that they used it, they liked it, and they want to use it again. There's some districts, some jurisdictions where it's still very much debated and some political factions disagree with the idea of ranked choice voting, but the data among voters who've used it is really very positive.
That's encouraging. So my final question for you, Kevin, is going back to Georgia. Obviously, we know that the presidential election race results in Georgia in November were very close, and the results in the Senate races, or at least one of them, were also very close, hence the need for this runoff for one of the seats. What happens if the results are really close again this time?
Oh, my goodness. We all go hide under the bed or something like that. But so the answer to this is there are two processes to talk about, and one is a Georgia process and one is a Senate process. And the Georgia process there are two key elements to it. One is if the margin of victory is less than a half a percentage point, there's an automatic recount that's triggered. That's a machine recounting of the ballots that were counted the first time just to make sure there weren't any errors. And then based on that, the results are certified. And so then the second round of kind of challenge that can happen in a close election at the Georgia level is that a losing candidate, after the results are certified, can challenge, it's called a contestation. The losing challenge can contest the results formally, and that leads to a trial. heard by a judge, where the evidence is presented and the burden is on that losing candidate to show proof that there were enough problems that are larger than the margin of victory. And that initial trial can then be appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, and depending on the circumstances, up to the Supreme Court. That's the Georgia process. But the thing to remember is that the Constitution of the United States makes it clear that the ultimate judge of the elections of the Senate is the Senate itself. It's not the Georgia Supreme Court. It's not the U.S. Supreme Court. It's the Senate has the right in the Constitution to judge the winners of the election. Now, if we're writing a Constitution now, we might not include that provision because we can see how it could lead to abuse, where you'd have the majority party in control of the House or the Senate that just votes to decide in close elections that just its side won. And that has happened, not very often, thankfully, but it has happened. There's a famous election in 1985 where the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives gave victory to its candidate against the results that had been accredited certified in the state of Indiana. So there's a scenario here that we should all be worried about where if the two Democrats win, you could face, and it's very, very close. And if the losing Republicans feel they have a claim that hasn't won in court, that you then have the Senate under the chairmanship of Mitch McConnell or speakership of Mitch McConnell voting on whether or not to seat the Democratic winners or whether or not to call a Senate commission that Republicans would probably have a majority of to investigate claims. And who knows what that could lead to. I think we should all hope we don't go down that path because it's a dangerous one for our country.
No, I agree. Thank you, I think, for that answer, Kevin. A little bit, and one more thing for us all to worry about, but hopefully we'll all go smoothly and it will just be sort of a hypothetical. Thank
Exactly.
you for joining us, Kevin, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in for this Election Bites. We will be back on Wednesday when we will be speaking to Larry Garber about what is happening in that joint session of Congress later that afternoon. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Avery.